The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, is a story of a nation collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. It begins not quietly, but with a thunderclap that shakes the very foundation of the United States. For decades, the country had balanced on a razor's edge, North against South, freedom against enslavement, unity against the desire to break away. Politicians negotiated, states threatened secession, and families divided over questions of morality, economics, and the future of the young republic. Yet even as tensions rose, many Americans still believed war could be avoided. That illusion shattered at dawn on April 12, 1861, when Confederate cannons roared across Charleston Harbor and blasted Fort Sumter into flames. At that moment, the United States was no longer a single nation. It was two. The North, armed with industrial might, swelling populations, and an unwavering belief that the Union must be preserved at any cost, prepared quickly for the long fight ahead. Meanwhile, the South, driven by the conviction that individual states possess the right to govern themselves, and determined to protect an economy deeply rooted in slavery, rallied around its new Confederate identity. Young men rushed to enlist on both sides, believing the war would be short. They imagined glory, adventure, and a quick victory. Instead, they stepped into one of the most brutal and transformative conflicts in history. As the months unfolded, the romantic notion of war dissolved into harsh reality. The first major clash at Bull Run shocked the nation. Spectators, expecting a quick Northern victory, instead watched chaos and bloodshed as Confederate forces pushed Union troops back in a stunning rout. The realization hit like a wave. This was not to be a brief or glorious struggle. It would be long, painful, and costly. The war quickly expanded into a vast, sprawling series of campaigns. Soldiers marched through dense forests, across scorching fields, and over frozen rivers, sleeping on muddy ground and eating whatever rations could be found. Disease claimed more lives than bullets. Camps became breeding grounds for infection, and makeshift hospitals overflowed with the wounded and dying. Letters home often carried the same haunting tone: fear, exhaustion, and the longing for peace. Yet duty kept them fighting, even as the cost grew unbearable. In 1862, the war's brutality reached new heights. At Shiloh, men were cut down with terrifying speed, leaving fields littered with bodies and the nation in shock. At Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, more than 20,000 soldiers fell in a matter of hours. Cornfields blazed with gunfire, and the sun set over a landscape so crimson that eyewitnesses struggled to describe it. But this Union victory, though costly, gave President Abraham Lincoln the moment he needed. Lincoln understood that the war could not be won simply by defeating the South on the battlefield. It had to be redefined. The issue at the heart of the conflict, the one that had divided the nation for generations, was slavery. By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in early 1863, Lincoln transformed the war from a struggle purely for union into a fight for human freedom. Enslaved people across the South heard news of the proclamation, whispered from plantation to plantation, becoming a beacon of hope and a promise of liberation. Many fled to Union lines despite staggering risks. Others took up arms, joining the United States colored troops and fighting with unmatched determination for the freedom they had been denied all their lives. With this bold move, Lincoln did not merely change the war, he changed the meaning of America. Meanwhile, the conflict raged onward with relentless fury. The Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863 marked a turning point. For 3 days, tens of thousands of men clashed across fields, hills, and rocky ridges. The fighting was so intense that veterans later said the ground seemed to tremble. On the final day, Confederate General Robert E. Lee ordered the infamous Pickett's Charge, an assault that ended in devastating loss. Thousands of Southern soldiers fell under withering Union fire, and the tide of the war shifted permanently. When the smoke cleared, the Union had won a decisive victory, and Lee's hopes for invading the North were forever crushed. Yet victory came at a terrible price. The dead lay so thick that burial teams labored for days beneath the summer heat. The small town of Gettysburg, overwhelmed by suffering, would carry the scars long after the war ended. In the months following the battle, President Lincoln visited the battlefield to dedicate a cemetery, and in doing so, delivered the Gettysburg Address, a speech so short yet so powerful that it redefined the nation's purpose. He reminded Americans that the war was a test of whether a country built on the promise of equality could survive. His words echoed through the generations. A nation of the people, by the people, for the people, must not perish from the earth. But the war was far from over. In 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman launched a bold campaign deep into the South. His march to the sea carved a brutal path from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying supply lines and crippling the Confederate war effort. Sherman's strategy, total war, was shocking, controversial, and effective. He believed the only way to end the conflict was to break not just armies, but the will to fight. Homes burned, railroads twisted, and entire towns felt the force of his advance. The devastation left behind was enormous, but it hastened the war's end. Meanwhile, in Virginia, the Union commander, Ulysses S. Grant, engaged Robert E. Lee in a relentless series of battles. These confrontations, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and the Siege of Petersburg, were brutal grinds of attrition. Grant, understanding the Northern advantage in manpower and resources, pressed on despite horrific casualties. Lee, brilliant but exhausted, fought desperately to hold the crumbling Confederacy together. Both armies endured unimaginable suffering. Trenches snaked across the landscape, foreshadowing the warfare of the 20th century. Soldiers lived in mud, surrounded by constant danger, knowing that each day could be their last. By early 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Food ran scarce, morale plummeted, and desertions rose. Cities fell one by one, until Richmond, the Confederate capital, finally succumbed. Fires lit the night sky as Confederate leaders fled. For many Southerners, it was a moment of heartbreak, an entire way of life coming to an end. On April 9, 1865, in the quiet village of Appomattox Courthouse, the war's end finally came. Lee, dignified but weary, met Grant in the parlor of a home belonging to Wilmer McLean. The two men, who had commanded opposing forces for so long, spoke respectfully. Grant offered generous terms, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home peacefully. When Lee rode away, Union soldiers silently saluted him, recognizing not the cause he fought for, but the courage with which he fought. The war was over. 4 years of agony had claimed more than 600,000 lives, leaving families shattered and communities forever changed. The battlefield dead rested in countless graves. The wounded carried scars, some visible, others hidden. But even as hope began to return, tragedy struck once more. Only days after victory, President Lincoln was assassinated. His death cast a deep shadow over the nation. The man who had steered the country through its greatest crisis, who had spoken of healing and unity, was gone when he was needed most. In the years that followed, America entered a turbulent period of Reconstruction. Freed African Americans sought to build new lives, exercise their rights, and claim the dignity they had been denied. Some white Southerners resisted these changes, while others embraced the new reality. The nation struggled to rebuild its shattered identity, to redefine citizenship, and to honor the sacrifices made on battlefields from Virginia to Tennessee. It was a painful journey, marked by progress, setbacks, and violence, but it laid the foundation for the nation that would emerge in the 20th century. The Civil War did more than settle the question of secession. It redefined what the United States stood for. It ended slavery, though freedom would still need defending for generations. It strengthened the federal government and reshaped the Constitution. But perhaps most importantly, it left behind a deeper understanding of American identity, one forged through conflict, built upon struggle, and committed, however imperfectly, to the ideals of equality and unity. The legacy of the Civil War lives on in monuments, in books, in memories, and in the very landscape of America. Fields once soaked with blood are now quiet, but they hold the stories of ordinary men and women who lived, fought, and died in a moment that shaped the destiny of a nation. Their sacrifices remind us that freedom is fragile, unity is precious, and the cost of division is etched forever into the soul of the United States. And though the war ended more than a century and a half ago, its echoes still guide America today, whispering warnings, offering lessons, and reminding future generations of the price paid to preserve the idea of a united nation.